Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This, as I mentioned to a couple people today, this conference is out of time, or this talk is out of time in certain interesting and significant ways. This is a Thursday. Most of our center events are Friday, so it's out of time in that way. It's also 2 weeks after our end of the year conference, so usually after our last conference, I feel like the year's over, and yet we're blessed to have one more event. And it's out of time in that it's 1 day early for the CIE conference on After Capitalism. So it's out of time, actually, in really 3 very wonderful ways. Chris Newfield is not out of time. He's, I think, just in time, in a sense, although perhaps some of our more pessimistic colleagues might think he's too late. But I've known Chris since the late 80s. Chris started out as an Emersonian scholar, which actually I did as well, interestingly enough, and that's where we first met each other. We were arguing over some Emersonian text or the interpretation thereof. After his PhD at Cornell, he taught at Rice University for 3 years, and since 1989 he's been at Santa Barbara, moving up the ranks until becoming a professor in 2001. His first book on Emerson is called The Emerson Effect, Individualism and Submission in America. He's also published 2 really important books on education and the economics of education in the U.S., Idea and Industry, Business and Making of the American University, and then more recently, Unmaking the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class. And he has another monograph due out sometime later this year called Lowered Education, What to Do About Our Downsized Future. In addition to his work, early work on American literature and his current work on economics of education, Chris also is interested in innovation, and especially innovation in science. It's a side of his work, I think, that many of us, I think, aren't aware of. And he's part of a 5-year NSF grant on nanotechnology and society in connection with that, and has done a number of other articles and other work on questions of innovation. I think that, as maybe we'll hear today, we certainly heard of Brownback this afternoon, his interest in innovation is not unrelated to the optimistic twist that he usually ends with after talks that can be very pessimistic to much of their content. Anyway, with that introduction, I'm really pleased to welcome Chris Newfield and joining me.
Thank you. Will there be slightly less buzzing if I turn this down again? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Buzzing to the speakers.
Okay. I'm very glad to be here. Partly, I'm seeing people I mostly know online that I've done a lot of collaborating with, Richard and Greg being 2 of them. I met some new people today at our brown bag conversation that I really enjoyed. And I'm also very happy to see Jane Gallup. My first job was at Rice University, and Jane was there. I was an assistant professor, and she was already reinventing French studies. And one of my favorite, probably my single favorite social professional memory for my whole career, and this was in the late 80s, was spending 2 hours in Jane's office, usually with Susan Lurie, in the period between when she finished her last class and when she got on the plane to come to Milwaukee. So thank you for being here. It reminds me that, actually, that one of the things that I felt then was, it was a smaller university and sort of a different period, was the possibility of intellectuality and sociality being exactly the same thing and being completely interconnected. And that was actually really what you modeled for me. So thanks for coming. And well, this is a bizarre tribute to that idea that I just mentioned, because it grinds through a bit of some schematic things. I'm going to just start to read, because if I start chatting about this, I will go on and on. I actually wrote a paper so that would not happen. But the thing that I wanted to say right at the beginning about the title is that it really does telegraph the message of the talk, and that is that the humanities are for revitalizing this absolutely pivotal institution that I think is really one of the only great things that the United States has invented as a kind of a new thing, a transition from reinventing the European university on this mass populist model. And I do not think that it can be continued or reshaped without us. It's just the path that it's on right now, where we are marginal, is fatal. So that's kind of the gist. And then this talk, appropriately enough, starts in Texas. I was giving another talk in Texas about public universities a while back. And before we began, someone introduced himself to me and said, "You're the guy who says we're destroying our public university systems." And I laughed and I said, "I'm now the guy who says that we succeeded." And so I meant it as a joke, but it's not really wrong. It will be easier, and I'm going to say more about this today, it will be easier for public universities to move forward successfully if we start from the idea that we have actually already ended our public universities as we understand the term. Obviously, the universities, the buildings, et cetera, and their activities will go on. The students, the administrators, the sports programs, the educational work in classrooms that define these institutions historically. But though the university carries on, its public foundations do not. Okay, so the first section is, what does public mean? Public university officials have, if anything, increased their emphasis on the word public in their justifications of policy and in their explanations of the mission. But they have at the same time defined public down. At UC Berkeley, top officials have taken to equating public with having a high percentage of low-income students. They invoke Pell Grant stats, and then once the fig leaf of poor students is in place, the campus is free to replace state resident students with non-residents, sever faculty from staff by putting staff into shared services tanks, which strips academic content from the administration that the staff do, and to steer every department towards unit-level entrepreneurialism, which is a phrase from the outgoing EBC at Berkeley, George Breslauer. University administrations cannot really subscribe to public service missions while converting even frontline educational activities into revenue streams, and yet that is exactly what they are trying to do. They can do this only because their definition of the public is sloppy enough to include activities that contradict and erode the public. One advantage of these careless and misleading definitions of public is that they disguise privatization, a term that at UC we are generally not welcome to use. So let me define the term public as it functioned in the great university systems in states as otherwise different as Texas and California and Wisconsin and Iowa. Okay, first, public meant mass access. The term access meant that you could afford to go and wouldn't run up debt. No one imagined that student debt would become a major outcome of attending university or that it would become a national profit center. The term access meant more fundamentally that you could get into the public university, that you would actually be admitted to it. UC campuses in the 50s and the 60s were all close to open admission into the early 70s, and most accepted all applicants who met baseline requirements. This year, in contrast, Berkeley and UCLA rejected more than 80% of their applicants. My own Santa Barbara campus rejects 2/3 of its applicants. A very high percentage of rejects are qualified, so we have the spectacle of public universities asking for public funds while rejecting most of the public who tries to get into them. Public research universities are increasingly like elite private universities in their propensity for rejecting applicants and bragging about their selectivity and the rejectability of their students. But private universities don't then turn around and ask for public operating money, and of course we do. Second, the public in public universities meant mass quality. The great flagships and the systems that were then developed around those flagships did not take a back seat in quality to the Ivy League universities that competed with them. And in emerging fields in particular often were better than the privates that were stuck in sort of older models. the publics offered quality on a scale that private universities could not and will never match. That was in research. And in teaching, the public idea was to elevate the individual capabilities of huge numbers of students. Public universities didn't reject everyone who wasn't already at a high level. They took nearly all comers and then improved them to some degree, at least after they got in. No offense to Stanford or Harvard, but these universities have pretty much zero public impact in terms of human capacity formation by admitting only students who are already at the top of the achievement pyramid before they even show up at the school. In contrast, there has been enormous public impact in taking mid-level achievers and making them good or great. Mass quality in public universities has meant reducing the mediocrity of the masses, taking the vast majority of we mediocre types and our middling backgrounds, average levels of ambition, and not so great personal focus, and making us really good at least some things. Math quality has consisted of building personal development on a mass scale, and this of course was the idea that in Germany took their university system to this kind of national foreground and becoming a champion of Germany as this site of enlightenment and progress that influenced Hegel and Marx in a different way, and so on. I mean, all of this was, of course, expected to lead to economic development, so that the moral land grant legislation demanded this, and everyone talks about this first as sort of the lead reason of why we should be funded in the first place. But the means, and also the tacit end, was instruction that combined subject mastery with individual cultivation. When they functioned well, public universities taught content while doing liberal arts style work on what we might now call, in Martha Nussbaum's term, creative capabilities. Content and personal identity were addressed together. Okay, and then third, the public and public universities meant sociocultural inclusion. Women, people of color, religious minorities, etc. were not only included, but even from time to time actively welcomed and valued. The most important form of integration was racial, but in a land where one recent cultural geography identifies 11 distinct national cultures within this space that we call the United States and Canada, public universities also established conditions of general cross-cultural equality. Assimilation to WASP norms became decreasingly the university's operative assumption. Okay, this was a long, slow road. The historian Michael Morans, who's also my blog husband, reports that white college participation rates for 18 to 24-year-olds passed to 27% in 1972, so talk about going on 50 years ago. But it was not until 1994 that the percentage of African Americans in post-secondary education was surpassed the 1967 number for whites, and it was not until 2009 that Latinos would pass that 1967 white number, and by then, of course, the white number had progressed quite a bit. Although the distance traveled was small and slow in terms of the pace of inclusion, the direction of the integrationist road was clear. Public universities were important sites of post-segregationist experience, which was the foundation for racial equality in a projected near-future society. Okay, we obviously don't even now live in that near future. We still have ongoing enormous problems of racial climate on campuses coast to coast. We ask whether African Americans feel like UCLA or Michigan Ann Arbor belongs to them as much as to others. The answer in 2014 is no. If we ask whether Michigan's college systems offer structurally equal opportunity for all racial groups, the answer is no again. But public did start officially to mean opposition to exclusion on the basis of race, culture, religion, or other identity, with the outcome being the possibility for the first time in U.S. history of a solidarity society formed by what we might call now the 99%. Okay, so I have actually kind of a summary. My Jesuitical background in high school inclines me towards schema. Maybe it will make some sense. There's changes in society on the left. There's a kind of a traditional stalwart position of a conventional middle class in the second column. And then there's this kind of intervention that starts to happen. Public universities shifting the imaginary of society is essentially what I'm arguing, towards creating a majority voting public, including the white portion of that, which was very much majoritarian, especially at this time, that would be basically a liberal bulwark rather than a conservative one. It seems a little bit flimsy now, but at the time it was serious enough and scary enough to produce the conservative mobilizations that led to the formation of think tank networks and so on. The Powell memo of 1970 is one famous example of this. Okay, my point is basically pretty clear in the title that these goals were important, and at the same time they're well beyond the shrunken horizons of the public university today, public, as we downgraded the definition of that. Okay, section 2, the public's material conditions. How would public universities fulfill these public purposes? To do this, certain material conditions had to be in place. Even the research campuses and public university systems needed to have a strong instructional focus. Its students were generally not the specialized, the specially customized blue chip type that were getting admitted to Yale and Duke. Public university students had potential, but it was more often than not underdeveloped. They were not second-tier minds, but their minds were more dependent on higher education for their eventual attainment. So lots of public university teaching needed to be done. This wasn't easy since funds were always limited. Lots of it had to be allotted to research and other activities. And major public research universities had faculty who necessarily spent much or most of their time in libraries and laboratories at a distance from undergraduates. The public research was obviously vital, and it was not, and it is not, to be compromised. But even as public universities limited teaching expectations for faculty so that research could happen, they also grew graduate programs and mixed mass instruction with seminars to allow a decent amount of face-to-face active learning. My university system was particularly aggressive in bragging about its low student-faculty ratio, which averaged 17:1, well into the 1980s. In the 2000s, the Office of the President at UC was still insisting that undergraduates were being taught to do research and enlarge the knowledge base, as sort of active contributors to it even before they got their BAs. In other words, undergraduate instructional quality was the core enabler of the public mission. Instructional quality was measured implicitly, not simply by where students ended up intellectually, but by how far they had traveled from first to final year. The public university also needed to integrate the academic and cultural lives of its students, particularly as a wider range of economic and racial backgrounds came into play. Much of this work took place through the evolution of student services that linked personal counseling, academic advising, and structured socialization of various kinds. Curricula enlarged slowly but irreversibly, and instruction sometimes evolved to allow the interaction of academic performance, personal experience, social identity. Tying knowledge formation to the personal experiences of young people is difficult and labor-intensive work. It is highly individualized. It cannot, in general, be standardized, and yet it is an important way of actually helping people to change, and to change what people really can do and even who they are. Okay, and then finally, public universities had to conduct high-end research while working on the individual cultivation of what we might call ordinary smart people, which meant justifying the way universities took rivers of taxpayer money and from a neoclassical production standpoint, flushed it out to sea. There had to be enough public funding to pay for huge numbers of people to register, take courses, get taught and graded, do individual work, and have their progress evaluated and certified. Public higher education is like public health in that the costs of a truly protective system are high and must be shared across the entire public with benefits. The funding had to be public because individuals simply don't use their private funds to support A, lots of other people who are B, not necessarily like them, and who are in addition C, not visibly great. the enormous public good of public university education is a big money loser, orthodox market calculations will simply not support it. Only public funds will support the instruction of the unwashed majority to help all of us go from the initial unimpressiveness in which 99% of us live our first 2 decades into a higher and more capable state. Okay, so I'm not claiming that public universities realize these goals in the strong sense of the term realized, but they did come within a country mile. Versions were achieved locally in every state with a significant subset of every public university population group. And they also occurred often enough so that they remained general aspirations for people going into public universities and for the society in relation to its public university systems. The goals and intermittent achievements formed a gravitational field that kept everyone's feet pointed more or less in the same direction. Okay, so here's a modification of this table that shows basically lines the means of high public funding. And it's the only thing that works. It's absolutely indispensable, and a lot of what I write is sort of about why that is. I won't belabor it today. And then mass active learning, again, this is a little bit science fiction-y in terms of how we wouldn't say that 99% actually got this or benefited from it, but it was the regulative ideal. And then the same for student services, which I think are often underplayed, at least by faculty, in terms of their importance to the formation of the people that are going through it. Okay, so the outcome in the right-hand column is egalitarian cultural and economic democracy. Again, it's the thing that's always just over the horizon, waiting for us if we actually implement these kinds of systems for real. Okay, I'm going to restrain myself from waxing on about this and what it means and how great it is and how it can save the planet, though it is great and can save the planet. But I'm going to cut now to the public university decline since 2008. Partly since affectively there's something much more satisfying about talking about failure and decline. And so this section is actually called the Great Surrender. As this 1970s wore on, the goals I've described here came under increasingly systematic attack and were discredited in many segments of the wider society. This is the story of the culture wars and the budget wars that I told in Unmaking the Public University. What also happened is that universities adjusted themselves to meet these critiques at least halfway. Senior managers made a set of decisions that became regularized across the country. In isolation, each decision was most likely quite simple, sensible, like a temporary dialing up of non-resident admissions to augment revenues until public funding recovers. But the interactive effects have been terrible, and the public university trapped itself in a privatization cycle that has damaged access, affordability, quality, and the public mission, and just basically public interest in what we're doing. I've just finished a separate book on this cycle of responses that has not just been reacting to macroeconomic conditions, but has actually helped lock in these cuts and participated in making them, and to impoverish the social impact of these institutions. But I'm going to skip over that and just pull out three features for the symmetry of it all that have been particularly important. Yeah. I mean, you kind of know that what's happening in the second column. We have the constant seeking of private as opposed to public revenues. So people are essentially measured on fundraising rather than on what happens to their public funding during their time in office. We have this thing I'm going to talk about a little bit more, the crisis of contingency labor and adjuncting, which is essentially telegraphing the message of that you don't actually need skilled, professionalized, and certified workers to deliver educational quality. You can do it with people that are interim or on the way to getting that. The professionalization process is not central to the thing that you're actually doing with instruction. And then there's the grotesque asymmetry between STEM and non-STEM fields around finances, which I'm going to get to a little bit later. But also just kind of culturally, such that the formation of people and then the solving of sociocultural problems is downgraded in relation to technological or socio-technical approaches to social problems. And the thing that, I would continue with this, there's lots to say about that, I'm going to come back to a little piece of it at the end. But the tragedy that I think is important to focus on is that these adaptive strategies have not produced the rewards that were expected. In other words, we have not actually compromised and we have not been paid back for these compromises. To the contrary, 7 years into a financial crisis that first surfaced in 2007, our financial situation in public universities is more precarious than ever. First, public funding per student remains nearly 30% below its level in the late 1980s, and that's kind of a national average, after adjusting for inflation. And yet state lawmakers are promising that funding will never return to where it was before. Second, the tuition escape hatch is being nailed shut. The national student debt crisis has put unprecedented and justified pressure on universities not to raise tuition to make up for lost state funds. Third, the bloom is off those alternative funding roses of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, federal research grants and philanthropy. For different reasons, neither of them has compensated for, nor will ever compensate for, public funding cuts. Fourth, last year's technological ride to the financial rescue has collapsed. I mean online education in the form of MOOCs, which were to use Silicon Valley genius to eliminate colleges' cost disease by replacing people with machines, as is regularly done in manufacturing. That higher ed had already spent 30 years cheapening its workforce with contingent faculty escaped their notice, and they'd already been doing it. So the next increment was not going to have the big budgetary effect that they assumed, but nonetheless it went forward. And fifth, public university officials, and this is people in universities, are now pushing harder and harder on ever more marginal strategies, the most familiar being increasing the enrollment of non-resident students so as to capture triple fees. Universities are also trying to goose more royalties out of patenting programs and have increased institutional borrowing. The University of California's debt has doubled, institutional debt has doubled in the last 5 years. In short, public universities continue to move through the stations of the privatization cycle that has simultaneously undermined fiscal solvency and damaged the public educational mission. The cycle has been devastating financially and educationally, sort of interactively. Much of the population now sees public universities as, at the same time, financially unstable and overpriced and debt-creating and not really preparing students for work. They often have an imprecise, that is the public, but unsettling sense that the central public goods provided by the public university have been canceled or shrunk. So, you can't really see the shrinking, but there's the free and open access, that just blissful sense of the future possibility of transformation. It really did have an affective correlative that I'm downplaying here, is gone. It's just been eliminated. And for the places that are still kind of free, like California community colleges, you can't actually get a seat in the classrooms because of the budget cuts. And instead of increasing tuition, they've just made seats scarce and have turned away hundreds of thousands of people over the last few years. And then the other stuff, it's still being done. The shrunken tide, you can't really see. It is still happening because we're all still working, and we're often working harder than we used to try to maintain, intellectual sustenance, to make sure that this isn't just the junk food university that we're afraid that it's becoming. And yet the impacts of that, the egalitarian impact and the building impact have been, downsized of necessity. Okay, few have much faith in the diminished university bridge. By few, I mean the society at large, between social challenges over there and non-conservative solutions. The university is just not where the change magic happens in the way that it has been in the past at various times. And where is the inspiring public educational mission that could make an increasingly sub-middle class U.S. population want to reinvest in public universities as places that imagine society, or a society built on current conditions that is both just and enlightened? That's the thing that needs to be reinvented, and that's the thing that is increasingly hard to get today. Section 4 is the recovery to come. Okay, so it's hard for me to skip past the dimwit because I love each of the disaster decision stages equally. And I'm going to actually come back to one around cross subsidies, but I'm going to move on now to what is to be done about this. We need to fix the present untenable situation. I'm going to make some suggestions about this. They cycle back to the humanities a little bit later, and they actually start with university administrators. Okay, so number one, admit we have a problem. All recovery programs begin like this. University officials need to admit that in recent decades, we have locked in major mistakes and misled many people, including students, parents, faculty, and political allies. They must especially stop saying that private funds, gifts, tuition hikes, etc., can replace public funding cuts. This encourages legislators to cut while making allies think that public funding wasn't all that special in the first place. We tenure-track faculty members also need to get involved in this, and we've been complicit with it. UC faculty like tuition hikes because they think that it's going to be more money for the educational activities that they care about. Most of us don't think that $20,000 of debt at graduation, which is kind of where the UC average is heading, a little bit lower at some campuses, is very much money, which is just a sign of a certain out-of-touchness around, what has become a kind of middle to upper, well, actually, in this country, an upper middle class job. And there's really been very little formal or even informal faculty opposition to using the tuition safety valve as a way of dealing with what seem like just hopeless, intractable problems in our state capital as well as yours. Democrats in particular really have lost touch of what public means in public university, that it's a high standard of function, and it's a high standard of outcome. It's not actually just this kind of thing that means more ordinary and low-income people, which is kind of how it's been defined in Jerry Brown's California. And we need to be part of re-educating Democrats to the point where they understand what the word public actually means. Okay, number two, university officials must state directly and openly that the cuts aren't part of the business cycle, but reflect a systematic restructuring of U.S. society. States didn't just cut public money in a downturn. U.S. corporate, financial, and political elites have essentially canceled the productivity bargain that underlay the relatively healthy version of middle-class capitalism. The productivity bargain was that if you invest time and effort to increase your personal productivity by graduating from university, you would be rewarded with a standard of living to match. As you became more productive, your wages would increase, and the expansion of the middle class reflected the increasing value of college graduate labor. The bargain has essentially been canceled for 4 decades. Here's a picture of it. This is the Mischel wedge. Sometimes it's named after Lawrence Mischel, who is the author of the State of Working America series and a kind of interesting policy-minded economist who's been tracking this. What you see is, you can't see it very well, but it starts basically at the end of World War II and it goes just a couple of years ago. And for the so-called golden age, what happened was that if you went to school and increased your productivity, you were pretty sure that just on average that you would be included in this kind of average structure. Your wage would go up in more or less in lockstep. In other words, as productivity increased, wages increased. Sometime in the 1970s, it wasn't like there was just an intrinsic economic change. I mean, there were some things that happened in the world economy that affected this. But there was a series of policy decisions involving the weakening of unions, tax changes, et cetera, that terminated it. So what you see from the 70s on is that American workers continue to increase their productivity at a pretty decent rate. And they fail to continue to increase their wages at a decent rate. The only way in the United States for the last 30 years to stay on the productivity curve is to be in the top 10 or the top 20% by income. Everyone else, 80% on down, has fallen off the increase even though they were, on average, increasing the actual value that their labor was producing. Okay, so this is, this is something that, it's revolutionary in the sense that there's something that's happening to the value that's being produced that's not going to the people that are actually doing it, and it happened at a fairly definable time statistically. And what it has done it has basically pulled the rug out from under the primary economic reason why people would go to college in the first place. Okay, this is actually something that Annie was talking about. University leaders have tended to hide the fact, including from themselves, that learning no longer equals earning. They perhaps know but do not say that a university degree is less the promise of a good life than an ante into a competition in which global university enrollments have doubled in the last 10 years, and in which the new global standard for knowledge workers is not high-skill, high-wage jobs, but high-skill, low-wage jobs. Public university folks need to say this. Perhaps the graduates of the most selective private universities, the double Ivies as I think of them, can scramble to the new commanding heights of the knowledge economy and accumulate huge salaries or even fortunes by acquiring control rights through exclusive organizational positions. But this is not a future available to the intelligent multitude emerging from our thousands of public colleges and universities. University leaders, in response to this, must proclaim to the working class, middle class majority that they and their children and their institutions of upper mobility, their public universities, are in trouble together and need to stick together for a change. I would love to hear the head of a major public research university say to anthropologist Nicholas Dirks at UC Berkeley that higher ed funding policies are IMF structural adjustment applied to the US's own population. That never gets said. If it came from someone like him, it was said 1,000 and a million times. That would change the discourse. That's the claim I'm making here. Okay, number 3. The new situation must push public university systems from lobbying, sort of back-channeling quietly in people's offices, to supporting social movements in relation to this. Officials need to be clear that their public universities, which created the mass middle class, can't appeal for proper funding to elites who don't want a mass middle class anymore. Okay, so here's a version of this. The left-hand column of this figure links the post-productivity era to our university issues. So instead of having this kind of democratizing of the economy, we have a plutocracy, which is more obvious than it was just a few years ago. We have this thing I just mentioned, the global auction, which is the name of a book by sociologists in Britain about this topic where you can do so many high skill jobs elsewhere for low wages that you can pay low wages where you started in order to basically coerce people into working on a global wage scale rather than on a local one that you used to have. And then finally, we're living in the strange era of the naturalization of all kinds of inequality. I'm going to talk about the sort of innovation culture version of this in a second, where people are openly saying that billionaires are better than other people, that the 1%ers there because they deserve it, that wages in Silicon Valley are flowing to the world's capability elites, and that's essentially how it should be. So anyway, that is a kind of, there's a longer story about how this replaced this progressive thing we're looking at here. But when we need the university to be the bridge, right, to do a translation or a meat grinder or something on the left-hand column, this more or less regressive social structure, it's weak and and also moving as quickly as it decently can towards working within the very structure that's killing it. And so that's basically what this pink and purple stuff is trying to say. And it's, the other thing I just want to pound on again is that this story needs to be told rather than hidden. The U.S. cannot generate a post-middle class economic order, shrink public university capability, and then do anything but shrink the post-war social compromise of middle-class democracy. Let me say that again. The idea that the U.S. is plutocratic now, or post-middle class now, has gotten a huge boost from the frenzied U.S. welcome accorded to the English translation of Thomas Piketty's book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, which made no sensation like this in France when it came out last year. Piketty's deep historical data are being taken to show that by mainstream people, Paul Krugman, Martin Wolf at the Financial Times, that under capitalism, there is no general tendency towards greater economic equality. That's Martin Wolf that latched onto this in the Financial Times. The egalitarian period that grew public universities was not the rule, Piketty's research confirms, but the exception. Public universities need to understand and then shout from the rooftops that there is no logic in plutocratic politics that will bring public universities back. Okay, to put this another way, rebuilding public funding for public universities now requires confrontation with the political system and with both its major parties, rather than patience and accommodation. Public university leaders can now succeed only by generating political and social movements in their behalf, rather than nurturing their relationships with influential players. Okay, next section is Humanities Bildung versus Schumpeterian innovation, which is, I'm trying to suggest, is a celebrity death match. But everyone hates this part, so brace yourselves. Okay, so the fourth measure is to rebuild budgetary support for the academic humanities as a domain that has for centuries carved out visions of human development that do not require what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Okay, this one is a little bit more complicated. I want to say a couple of things about him because he remains enormously influential and enormously influential behind the Darwinistic, the Spencerian tendencies in IT culture and tech culture in general, even if venture capitalists and engineers and so on don't quote him directly anymore. In fact, I had a German engineer sitting next to me on a plane when I was fiddling with these slides, and he said, I can't help noticing Schumpeter. I said, yeah. He said, well, actually wasn't German, he was from Austria. He said, Austrian. I said, that's right. He said, but is this a history project? And I said, no, he's a vital influence on our society today. And he looked at me like, you're insane. And he said, well, I'm an engineer and we never talk about Schumpeter. Therefore, he doesn't count. He has no influence. Like he's not a force that we recognize. This guy was wrong. We had a very interesting discussion about that. His thought lay behind the epochal 1970s shift from seeing capital as a bulwark of political reaction, which is how a huge part of the US population, as well as elsewhere, saw capitalists, saw big business, to seeing at least high-tech capital as the fountainhead of innovation and creativity. Okay, so I'm going to show you these slides, even though if I'm going to show them, people never invite me back. So anyway, nice night. This is, there it is. This is the famous definition of creative destruction. Okay, the fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumer's goods, the new methods of production and transportation, the new markets, the new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprise creates. Okay, so I mean, he really did see all of the new that's coming from them, and a particular type in particular. The opening up of new markets, foreign and domestic, and the organizational development from the craft shop and the factory to such concerns as U.S. steel illustrate the same process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. The process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. It is what capitalism consists in and what every capitalist concern has got to live with. Right? So there's a soft version of this which just says that you constantly have to adapt to the market. And then there's a strong version of this which basically says there is no social activity of any value that isn't about this. And I'll just run through these easily. Economists thought this was revolutionary because he does insert in the capital accumulation process that many of them learned from Marx as well as other sources, investment in technology that then goes to jobs and that then goes, keeps the whole capital money, capital cycle going. But the most important thing about this is that innovation comes from this special breed of unique person known as the entrepreneur. And basically there are not very many of them, and they're the only ones that can actually pull this off. So he painted Bayer and U.S. Steel as much as he hated socialism, because he just thought they were inert bureaucracies that was ensnaring the entrepreneur in their grip. The third is that social relations and governance are intrinsically anti-innovative. So innovation must disrupt all of them. And so just to bring it and take an example close to home, when Sebastian Thrun from Udacity comes to your town and tells the Vice Chancellor for Business or the Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education or whatever, whoever the person is, that finally Gutenberg has been surpassed by the MOOC, and then that person signs a contract without actually consulting the faculty, the academic senate, et cetera, around those contracts. It's a simple expression of the right that far-sighted administrators have to partner directly with entrepreneurs and eliminate the anti-innovation people that are trying to hold innovation up by governing, by having social relationships, by talking to each other and deliberating, by doing democracy of any kind. I mean, it sounds like I'm overstating it, but actually I'm not. And it's, the surprise on the part of a lot of administrators that faculty would be concerned about this, and then they would try to claw this back, and then the pushback from administrators around, this is the future, this is progress, it owes a lot to this idea that people that work on governance and work in groups are essentially not innovating, but opposing it. The next thing is that any level of inequality, including the ones that we have now, basically justified by the risk-taking that's involved in innovation. So there's a built-in justification for whatever level of innovation you want. This is the true time about that. Okay. Innovations, and then, yes, real innovation always involves replacing human labor with technology. And that includes replacing creative labor, that is, people that have gone to college, that have acquired high skills. Pretty soon, web designers are going to be automated. This is the plan, right? It's the idea. And instruction, the MOOC dream was that was already automated through the algorithm that they developed basically in 2012. So it reflects this logic that is part of the sort of the development of Western capitalism. And the way that I would summarize it is that all human and cultural factors are a drag on capitalist dynamism. That person that wants to move an institution forward has to just be like the prow of the ship that pushes that stuff. And that means basically all of the human sciences out of the way. One of Schumpeter's most influential popularizers has been the columnist Thomas Friedman, whose 1990s blockbuster, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, nicely encapsulated the core implication of Schumpeterian innovation. Cultural tradition impedes progress, so to have nice cars and everything else, abandon, even pave over the olive tree, certainly chop it down. In this model, the humanities are simply regressive and obstructionist, and so are all the issues we regularly discuss, like white supremacism, nationalism, neocolonialism, heteronormativity, disruptive signification, and modes of cultural activism. In Schumpeter's and Friedman's innovation culture, the purpose of capital and technology joined together is to overcome culture, understood not as a mass commodity, but as human relations. The 90% are disrupted by the 1% because the 90% look backward, while the next 9%, including everyone with a post-bachelor's degree, either understands entrepreneur-driven progress or accepts it and supports it. Unfortunately, Schumpeter-Friedman radically demotes the illimitable freedom of the human mind, to quote what Thomas Jefferson saw universities as supporting, where the human mind in its full social relations didn't lead to entrepreneurial technology. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that the academic humanities are in reality outside of this fictional world that is incredibly influential to this day. What I'm saying is that the academic humanities are a pivot of sustainable development, and that development is less sustainable when the academic humanities and the deep forces they represent are diminished. Reversing this diminishment that we've been living through now for about 30 years, and this is the fourth measure, requires confronting Schumpeterian innovation as a model. Okay, so this is basically what we get if we don't, and this S innovation, thing over here is just kind of the intensification of the regressive social tendencies that we're already looking at. A minoritarian democracy of, sort of basically tech, social engineering, plutonymy, to use the Citibank consultant word, coupled with the precarity that we've all seen growing. And the MOOC design of hiring masses of essentially adjuncts to be course administrators or course assistants, as an example of that. And then there is an assimilation to innovation culture, which is part of this thing that I sometimes call Spencerian technogenesis, which the technologists that are essentially it's not the philosopher kings, it's the technology kings that occupy that familiar position in a society that is Tyrell Corporation-like, justly hierarchical, where the people who can do end up designing a more optimal society for the rest of us who just complain a lot. All right. So if we shift it a little bit, then I'm just, we should probably talk about this a bit later if anyone's interested. In some ways, this is the kind of the most important material, and I really, it's a collaborative enterprise in developing it in a way that, reflects our values, our practical situations that are different in different institutions, and it also seems socially powerful. So I'm interested in getting that conjunction, and this is really a work in progress. But the things that I think are really already in place that the humanities still stand for, including with people that don't like them, is mass intellectuality. Anybody can take a Shakespeare course and learn to read somewhat decently and become something like an independent thinker. It's not something that's just for the algorithmic specialists. The second, there's this whole discussion about the industrious revolution that is kind of the East Asian model of capitalism that some people that I particularly like Giovanni Arrighi, have argued is replacing the Western model, which is energy intensive and technology intensive, and basically in this argument in decline. The interesting thing about the humanities in this structure is that it's actually already teaching the kinds of knowledge, skills, interactivity, passion, imagination that is required more by this post-industrial, post-Western something, some kind of economy, than is the economy that we're kind of driving a nail into now. And then egalitarian non-assimilationist pluralisms is again the continuation of all of the amazing social thinking and theorization that's been going on in the humanities for the last 50 years, including from people that are sitting in this room. It's the only sort of survivability platform in a planet with 7 billion people that is minority white, that is increasingly non-Western, that requires collaboration rather than monopolization for solving its problems. So there's an enormous amount of stuff that I think is more or less on the horizon. I connect people like Gayatri Spivak, Doris Summer, other theorists of reading to Arrighi and the understanding of what labor has to do in this kind of economy to come. But it's a longer story, and I'm happy to give you little pieces of it a bit later if you're interested. What I want to end on here is a couple of institutional notes. The fifth and sixth measures are major reforms that we don't actually need anyone outside of the university to help us with, that we can implement and that have to come from a discussion on the inside. The fifth measure is full costing for extraneurally funded research. Our pride and joy STEM research loses large amounts of money for public universities, both private and public. And you can't even see my favorite slide. Can you see the bars over here? Mm-hmm. This is from Arizona State. The fiction is that the science is bringing the money, humanities and social sciences spend it. The reality is the opposite. What happened here is that a senior official at Arizona State University actually released figures that I think are, are calculated in most universities, at least I hope so, that show that when you actually compare income and expenses across divisions, what you find is that you're losing, in this case, about 20, $25 million in the division, not of the humanities, but of engineering. but you're losing a similar number in the physical sciences, you're losing a somewhat smaller number in the natural sciences, and so on. And when then you look over here on the right for the bars that go up, where you're making enormous amounts of money, where things are running positively, the first thing you see are the social sciences, which are incredibly cheap and have lots of enrollments. And you also see the liberal arts and humanities more or less in positive territory. I'm a STEM lover who thinks that we need to do more basic scientific research and not less, but it needs to be fully funded, and it needs to be fully funded now. The sociocultural and artistic disciplines are simply too poor to go on floating the university by taking their profits and moving them over to fill holes on the STEM side. Right? It was nice for a while. We never got credit for it. Nobody really admitted that it's happened. They didn't say thank you. And now that we can't actually do this anymore, it's too late for thank you. It's just time to sort of fix that. Okay, then the sixth and final step involves refocusing universities towards their core missions of research and teaching. The genius of the university was to unite these functions: discovery, invention, creative practice, explaining, reformulating, disseminating. These were all fundamentally united activities. A professor was someone who read, thought, wrote, discovered, invented, and taught all these things. 30 years of privatization focused on cutting labor costs has produced a dissociation of educational sensibility that savages academic labor and educational quality for students. And here's one illustration from the AAUP's recent salaries report, aptly titled, Losing Focus. This is, I don't know if you can read it, but this is over the last 35 years. Full-time, non-faculty professionals have grown about, 359%, because I see that actual number. Part-time faculty have grown 286, full-time non-tenure track faculty 259%, full-time executive 141. Over here we have full-time tenured and tenure track faculty has grown at 23%. And basically for 35 years, universities have grown mostly in non-academic managerial activities. They have paid for this by hiring contingent faculty to replace full-time faculty, both part-time, and full-time non-tenure track faculty have grown faster than tenure track faculty by a full order of magnitude, 10 times faster. This amounts to a radical redefinition of what a university is and what its people primarily do. Adjuncting in particular has for decades been endangering the long-term health of every intellectual discipline by diminishing our ability to actually reproduce the academic functions of universities as opposed to its larger administrative ones. This has also seriously damaged the university's public reputation for humane and enlightened practice towards its own employees. It has routinized the practice of universities exploiting the very people whom they expect to carry them into the future. And this hiring pattern has to stop. The managerial edifice that is bulked up can also be pared down. Public universities will need to be debureaucratized. We need to freeze staff hiring without actually freezing payroll budgets. We have to set goals for correct ratios, which this is not, of non-teaching to teaching and research staff as way below what they now are. We must recenter university activities and payroll on teaching and research. The growth ratios shown here need to actually be completely reversed, just 10 times more full-time than the other way around. I'm not talking about mass layoffs of non-faculty professional staff. I am talking about the conversion of existing staff to direct involvement in teaching and research. For example, the creation of research learning groups in which staff would work with faculty to guide undergraduate student research. Money saved through the reduction of staffing and non-academic functions would be shifted towards academic staff and academic functions, allowing contingent faculty members to become permanent. After all, we're not medical insurance companies, we're universities, and the proportion of our work that's being done as though we're processing claim forms and doing fundraising and outreach of various kinds, and basically managing the internal metabolism of the institution has gotten completely disproportionately out of line. Maximum staff needs, attraction of staff needs to be directed any way that we can, and again, through a collaborative process towards actual higher learning. Okay, so in sum, my answer to what the humanities are for is that they are for putting mass building back at the center of the post-capitalist university that is now in the early agonies of its birth. The public university is dead. Long live the public university. Yes.
Hi, I'm a UCSB alum, so that, yeah, undergrad and my master's there. And I was struck by your description of the public university throughout, because as both a faculty member and an administrator here at UWM, where I've been for almost 30 years, what you described as the public university in some ways resonates with our context here, and in other ways simply does not. So in a sense, when you talk about free and open access at, let's say, the University of California system, even as a young person, I mean, only 10%, only the top 10% that would go to UC. Then there was the state system, and there was the city college system. Here in Wisconsin, we also face a really different situation, a real demographic challenge, where you're describing in California, where I have lots of friends, many who are at UCSB still, turning away students and everything based on, and you're even saying community colleges, not enough seats for students. Here we face, an opposite trend of a declining demographic, and we are the access institution, which is of consternation to some people here who feel that that's a dumbing down in this current context where the research institution is based on selectivity. I think many of us are very proud of the access mission that this university holds, but we are facing declining numbers radically. So that we're in a really different situation, and I just wonder if you'd comment a bit more about your definition of the public university. I don't think that we're unique or alone in this, but the situation of the public university and the flagship campuses or the top tier, University of California system, I think it's just a really different kind of challenges. Many of it is similar, but I was struck, for instance, when you said, you made the remark just in passing about international students being, we can pay, they'll pay 3 times as much, and it's shifting so that we're blocking out, the public that used to be served. Here in our state, it's simply, this morning I went to a meeting to try to argue for more support. We're supposed to reach a very high target number of international students to recruit here. We're in a complete meltdown in terms of our enrollments, and we are so tuition driven.
When you say meltdown, what do you mean, number-wise?
Declines, radical declines.
Like 10%?
From, what would you say, Peter? 10%, but it's continuing to decline. And as the demographic data for the next, 8-10 years in this state. And anyways, what I'm trying to say is, at this meeting, I was trying to argue that, of course, my unit has been the most successful in recruitment. And we are, not even at 3% of the university population. There's plenty of room for more international students at this institution where they pay twice as much, not 3 times as much. And one of the persons on this committee said to me, well, this isn't going to float. He's head of the Hernandez Center, and he said, what about the African American students? This is supposed to be an access institution for them. Why are we, they're going to say, why are we educating these Chinese? And I tried to explain to him that it's not an either or, that in fact in our particular context, we're not Berkeley, we're not Madison, where Madison last year increased its domestic numbers so they could bring in more out-of-state payers, which hurt us a lot. I tried to say that it's not either or, that in fact the dollars that come from international students paying double the tuition, we try to really bring back to support students of color, study abroad for students of color who haven't had opportunity. We're just, I guess my question after all these remarks is how you define, the public university, because I find, at least in our context here, which I'm very committed to and concerned about, we're facing slightly different challenges.
There is a difference between growth and non-growth in terms of the revenues that you can try to generate and how you would do that. But the rule about the future mission, I think, is the same, and that is combining research with access. I mean, we're, the sub-flagships in the UC system
Right.
are also trying to
Everybody.
get, yeah, but in order to get the next tier, the third tier, the fourth tier students, who also deserve to be educated
I agree.
in a quality way, but we have to actually figure out how to structure the system so that they can benefit from that. Research access are compatible activities, not contradictory activities. And a semi-open admissions school that offers, student production around knowledge, I think would be actually quite attractive. The challenge would be to figure out how to restructure the workforce, including pulling people who are not actually working on academic stuff now in academic contexts, into doing that. So it's going to mean more hands-on training and teaching. It's going to be more basic work. It's going to be more what we call stupidly, I think, remedial work. But why isn't that a business model that would work for this school that has a special mission in comparison to Madison, which is, I think, unfocused in the same way that Ann Arbor is all over the place and Berkeley is all over the place.
But it's about the perceived, if public
Well, yeah,
education
so
was
there's
a public good, and it's now a private good. So
Yeah, but
that,
that's what,
I don't agree with
that,
that,
no,
I'm
no, no,
just
it's
saying.
not just that we don't think it, the public doesn't think that. There's actually polling data that shows that people think that there's too much, the tuition's too high. Everybody can name the two missions of the university. Get a job, develop yourself, discover who you are. People put that second mission in a different way, but people identify it in only slightly smaller percentages. We are not alone in society in thinking that build-in has to happen, along with some kind of practical, enlargement of ability. So I think the big fight is with ourselves. I don't think the big sell is with the public. First, we have to wean ourselves of selectivity and status as the primary metrics of whether we're being successful professionally. And that's a lot of it. The person that I've been fighting with my whole career, Walter Ben Michaels at the University of Chicago, University of Illinois Chicago, wrote this really very interesting thing around the union battles that they were having, their pride in the mission of educating working class, first generation, et cetera, people. And then also using the union context in the salary battles to explain what the money is for quality-wise in terms of education. That we have these smaller classes. I actually do spend the time to grade your paper as opposed to just skim it and grade it. I mark sentences. I look at least one draft during the semester before you turn it in and I grade it, etc.
No, I found all the stuff at UIC very resonant for our own situation without, but again, demographic are different. But anyway.
I have a question in a completely different register than the talk, but I'm just curious about it. Which is the same register. But I was just wondering whether or not, I want to maybe agree for different reasons with your engineer seatmate about Schumpeter. And ask whether or not, Schumpeter's model is very much a macroeconomic account. It's very much an account that's about an industrial capitalism. It's very much about big corporations.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether or not the sort of resonant discourse that we need to identify and to combat is something more like the sort of microeconomics of, say, the human capital thesis, or that kind of the ways in which, as the economy shifts from industrialism to post-industrialism, and which is largely a service economy in the United States, that the discourse around what capitalism looks like maybe sounds a lot more like Gary Becker than like Schumpeter. Just a sort of question about whether or not it's really, people at Google like to say creative destruction, but I'm not sure that the sort of dominant discourse is located so much in that more, he talks about U.S. Steel, right, in that passage that you brought up. And I don't know that U.S. Steel is our dominant model of capitalist organization today.
Yeah. No, and that's a really good point, and if I could ever imagine putting two economists in the humanities talks at one, and he would be a good person. There's also, actually, I have given talks about Thomas Stewart and about sort of the 90s knowledge management discourse, which really slotted certain kinds of soft skills people into the subordinate zone, and gave principles that were very clear about who you would prefer, and they're basically direct bottom line people, and who you would disprefer, the word is in most of these other folks. So there is a dimension of human capital arguing that I think plops directly onto this. I don't think that it changes who gets valued, whether it's Becker or somebody else, in the current economy. It's people that seem disrupted by having a joy in destruction of current, who are fearless about doing that. And an example is Peter Norvig, who taught the first big MOOC that gave him the idea for Udacity with Froon in the fall of 2011 at Stanford. Gave a talk at the first online conference that I went to at Berkeley in 2013 when this was really peaking. And he said, well, basically journalists were, just kind of riding on, being able to do a lot of cut and paste until their advertising model got disrupted by Google and other companies. And now they really have to go out and investigate and basically work for a living. Well, that's not the phrase that he used. And it's completely upside down. Basically what he saw was that these knowledge workers called journalists were slackers. And although they'd formed their human capital, it was this thing that just needed the Schumpeterian electrodes implanted, connected to them. And then that now is allowing them to do the job that actually they were much better at doing before because they actually had the resources to do it.
Thank you so much for this lucid and inspiring and depressing talk. I do want to push you a little bit more to help me think through the problem and benefits and opportunities of the quote-unquote globalizing university, right? So on the one hand, we have a situation where both top-tier AAU member public and private universities seem to be moving towards being institutions for making financial asset-owning classes everywhere, right? On the other hand, the social movement, right, this is the kind of, well, you really saw that in the ASA backlash anyway, but that's another story. But then the social movement you're calling for, right, seems to me on the one hand, it seems to fall on the sort of nationalism versus transnational solidarity, right? So on the one hand, if we want to sort of be talking to Democratic politicians and reinvigorating the public, I guess we're back to saying what's the public? The Republic University, then we're speaking nationalism again. If we're talking social movements that explain and talk about non-egalitarian, non-assimilative, sort of egalitarian, pluralistic, I went the opposite way there, egalitarian, sort of pluralistic kinds of inclusion and creative solidarities and anti-capitalist solidarities, right? Then we're talking transnationally. So
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, my first publication was an argument against both and logics, and all I find myself doing now are both and logics. And this is another one where it has to be, we have to really hold politicians' feet to the fire, using Piketty, using whoever is handy to say that it seems to make sense to them. To say you're destroying your society with this disinvestment in everything that made the society good in the first place. So they do have to care about America. And this is something that Robert Reich raised in the early 90s, and it's completely blown off in the Work of Nations. But he talks about the politics of secession and said, well, the elites are going to secede, but of course they're such nationalists that they won't. The last part was wrong and the first part was right. So there is that. There's kind of a, I don't know what to call it, international nationalism, and then the flip side of it is the international part where, because all these problems are global now, everybody's constantly saying how global they are, including Thomas Friedman. We say, while we are not wrecking our own society and in fact rebuilding it, we are going to do that interactively and not this race, not in the race to the bottom thing that is helping China and India slightly, but maybe helping the West then were we to do some kind of collaborative development together. And I realize that flies in the face of human nature and international history and so on, but it does also seem like the moment in world history and climate history where we can actually have a serious talk about this.
Yeah, I guess I want to circle back a little bit to some of what Patrice was saying about the local context here and thinking, about what we've been struggling with. The story that you tell in Unmaking the Public University is pretty easy to map onto what happened in Wisconsin, with some major differences around how the macroeconomic situation here, deindustrialization and racial segregation, have impacted things. And what we've seen here as well as elsewhere is that when capital is in crisis, it looks for new forms of extraction, right? And so the university has been plundered. And that's one way to talk about what's happened to universities around the country as well as what's happened here. It's not simply that the budgets have been cut. Certainly the students have been plundered. The extraction of wealth from students through tuition over the last few years and through then the student loan program has been a source of capital, right, for a system that's in crisis. The university was a flourishing enterprise when capital went into crisis, so it turned there to extract, right, by budget cuts and to plunder, right, that institution, so that we get into this downward spiral, where the latest thing that happens is that the state government issues another tax cut where everybody's in the state's going to get $50 or $75, because there's no thought of the socialization, right, of these resources. So people are plundered, they're desperate, they're angry, and the politicians give them $75. So I think
Rich supporters way more than
well, I'm looking forward to.
that. There you go.
I'm looking forward to getting a little bit more. But I do think, in terms of your program for how we should be talking to the public, I do think it's important we find a way to talk to the public about how their institutions are being robbed and how the resources that their parents and grandparents built up and invested in for their grandchildren are being stolen.
Yeah, that's really well said. I
We
agree.
need to change.
They're very special, that kind of instrument. The other thing I would just add to that is that I'm not nostalgic for the factory version of these institutions that were modeled on the factory. People like Kathy Davidson are right about that. The new version, the long-lived version, is not going to have everything bolted to the floor. PowerPoint, we are going to advance actually in the way that we learn. But we just need the funds and also the non-invasive political structure to allow it to actually happen.
And I think that the other thing I would say is that the counter narrative today about the public good in which many universities are becoming, through some of their own entrepreneurial activity, engaged in the common good in their community through various kinds of partnerships with nonprofits around food security or poverty or racism. These are really important things for us to emphasize and build on. The humanities and social sciences certainly led the way in there, and there's a lot of good public feedback that comes from breaking the wall between the ivory tower and the community and building up those kinds of activities.
Yeah, absolutely. And this seems like a perfect place for them, isn't it? Or not?
Well, to some extent, except for the way in which the mantra that the university has to be the driver of economic development for the state skews the work towards STEM, water technology, the new engineering campus investments, et cetera, et cetera.
What if we talk about human capital like Danny brought it up? Because on the back of my mind is thinking that she's right, that this is to go positive around this, that's an effective way to manage it. Yeah. Would that work? I mean, because you're talking about, on California has this problem too. We have maybe somewhere between 50 and 60% of high school students leaving or graduating who take the subjects that make for UC or Cal State eligibility. So we're talking about, 40% of high school students are not eligible to two of the three, to any of the public four-year universities. They graduate ineligible to ever do that. So, this is the kind of thing where partnering, and I know when I say this to university audiences, when I was saying the committees, people would say, well, that's remedial stuff, that's a K through 12 problem, most people have to get their own house in order, that's not my job, that's not what we do. But I think actually the partnership model is really progressive, and there's enormous political capital in saying the words at least. I'm assuming it's true here too, and it would be really true in Milwaukee and not in Madison, to say what works in California, and that is we are partnering with the schools, and we are doing outreach in the rural high schools of the Central Valley where they have 35% high school graduation rates in some cities, et cetera. And we're working to refix the pipeline to make the valuable workforce and also the self-directed humans that most people I think lose on.
That's a long story, I'll tell you.
Yes.
Maybe we should give some thought to the fact that we're not the first culture to confront the development of plutocracy.
Yeah.
The Athenians did too. And
Sorry,
all they
who
did, the Athenians,
Yeah.
and its catastrophic consequences for the social balance in the society of the time of Aristotle. And Aristotle's answer to it was a little different than what you're moving toward here. His answer to it was to address the question of the education of the elite and the character education on the assumption that those individuals who control the levers of power and the system resources and intrude onto the university system with their interests and so on really need to be educated to character. And their enlightenment is a critical issue to society as a whole. The flow of capital, the concentration of capital in the hands of the few is a social inevitability.
Mhm.
So, in fact, educating the few who misuse the system and abuse the system from their position of power has a significant impact on society as a whole. It's an indirect approach.
Mhm.
But it worked
Mhm.
in Athens for a time, at
Mhm.
least. When he created his lyceum outside of Athens, he deliberately chose to educate the sons of the elite in character, philosophically, and so on. And they went back to government. And Aristotle was not naive about finance. Interesting, as unusual that might seem. They went back to government with quite a different approach to government and managed for at least a period of 50 years to clean up a lot of the problems in the society. I mean, for him, government was an association of men, unfortunately not women, but and the association of men of character, which was what made for good government, it seems like a timeless formula to me. Maybe it still hasn't changed. Less the aspects of technology and globalization, of course. Who are the individuals who are controlling the levers of power, and what is their consciousness, enlightened or otherwise?
Yeah, the next sentence to me is important. Once we establish what you correctly established, which is the elitist nature of liberal arts self-development or built in its origins, do we then develop a populist or an inclusive model of education that excludes that on the grounds that it's elitist? Or do we build a populist educational structure that includes it on the grounds that everybody needs the same thing elites need? And I just go in the second direction.
Yeah, and Athens didn't.
Yes.
Not that I'm advocating it, we shouldn't, but Athens didn't have really a place for public education. But they certainly understood the power of an educated aristocracy, a meritocracy.
People that have been really interested in the classical model then updated it to try to, this happened, the Germans in the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson, I quoted briefly, the Moral Act that created land-grant universities popularized it, for bad reasons as well as good, but nonetheless. And then the post-World War II expansion really brought it out with liberal arts being a central justification. If you read the so-called Truman Report in the late 40s, it sharply criticizes liberal arts value that is retained just for people that go to Harvard, and wanted exactly that thing as an Americanism, as an anti-communism, as a thing that they thought was an absolutely mainstream idea. And then all the amazing things that theorists and sort of people in the liberal arts disciplines have been doing, from social history to queer theory endlessly for the last 40 years, is the same kind of thing. It's taking society, taking the knowledge and the experiences of social movements and bringing them into academic knowledge and vice versa. And that freaked out a lot of people. So that's been the thing that's been targeted by culture wars and so on. But they didn't like it because it was so powerful. And because it wasn't just happening in Harvard. I mean, it wasn't just radicals and revolutionaries that had those ideas. Because that's a small group in both cases. It was happening to the tens of thousands of people that were coming out of, Cal State Fullerton, and later on, the regional colleges of all the the other states. That's what they were worried about, and they were worried about it because it was real.
Because it's already happening, right? I mean, the crazy thing about today is actually the most crazy thing to imagine is that, think about these non-Ivy League liberal arts schools, where maybe a third of the student body receives no financial aid at all, which means that they are paying for 4 years, $300,000 for a private liberal arts degree? I mean, that's crazy to me. That's just, and amazing, and not as crazy as it is. That's as crazy as the fact that you have 100,000 people not able to get into community colleges in California. Because they're sort of two sides of the same thing. There is this large portion of the elite population, of the rich population, that still thinks it's totally worth it to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for 4 years of private education.
And it might be for that. For all sorts of reasons, including, connections, networking, pedigree, and noble value.
Yeah.
But my reaction to that is, this is great. They love us. People will pay for this. We're fabulous. Our stuff is fabulous. This material is transformative. It's extremely exciting. We just have to figure out the structure that will allow people, everybody to have it. Is that what you're saying, Tim?
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Okay, good.
I would only add, that's a very valuable ideal, but historically, I don't know if it's realizable now. I'm dubious.
Well, it's going to be really, really hard, but I don't think it's impossible. I also think it's necessary. I just don't see what else we can do.
So just in response to what Anne was saying, when you said the president, so I have a child and about 4 years ago, we went around and visited a lot of these liberal arts colleges. I haven't been to a liberal arts college, maybe ever. But, I did course, I never taught college. But we went there and it blew me away. I was very moved by, so they're speaking to prospective parents, right, just like in high school. And they are selling this idea to some number of people who are going to, give them money for it. But what was amazing, what blew me away is this was the discourse that I still remember from the 60s in the university, and it didn't sound at all like what I've been surrounded by for the last 40 years. That discourse is alive and well in those institutions. It's working for them, it's making them money, etc. So one of the questions is, how do we get that discourse back into universities, into public universities? Because it's working for a constituency. Yes, it's working for those rich people, but it's also working for the middle class and lower parents whose kids are going to get scholarships, because a lot of the schools have scholarships. So that the discourse that of the 50s and 60s of building and all of that is actually alive and well and very widespread at these schools that have taken on a very different idea. So I just wonder how to think about, how to open that card.
I think we just start doing it, talking about it. I talk about it in my lecture courses with 200 students on detective fiction. We have TAs, this is limited, we're trying to develop the feature, etc.
Right. Richard's point about pedigree, it's working, I think that's what makes them feel good about the place. But the reason you send your kid to the private school and not to the one where you get the actual liberal education is you walk away with connection. Right? At least
But it's very widespread. I mean, so like we went to Lawrence University in this very state, right? And yes, you get some connections there, but I mean, I was like moved because here it was 2010, and people were, I wanted to move there immediately. I wanted to get away from this university, which is, always about business partnerships and, all of that. And, so yes, and of course it's a discourse, it's public relations, it's marketing, etc. But that marketing device, whatever it is working somewhere. And so I'm just interested that there was such, I actually had, because I basically don't know anybody who goes to or teaches at liberal arts college, I didn't realize that just, and we went to like 10 of them in both the Midwest and the East, and they all have that discourse. It's very widespread, it's very successful. There is some different discourse in marketing going on, even though, they're academics too, they're administrators, these are administrators.
But you didn't buy it.
Oh, no, my daughter decided she wanted to go to a public university because they had a big football team.
There you go.
Right, but her father and I that's where we wanted to send her because it still had those values that were ours when we went to college. And so it was just, so I don't know, but it's like breaking down, I mean, lots of academics teach in liberal arts schools, lots of academic administrators teach there. Why are there these really separate discourses that it doesn't cross?
Yeah, we made a big mistake.
So two things I would say. One, I had a similar experience when I took my son to college. I thought it was a class-based model to a large extent, even the difference between Cornell and Middlebury, because at Cornell we have the kids who want to come up for the hotel school or for the engineering school, and so when you ask them, what do you want to do, they have these pragmatic, job-oriented majors, and at Middlebury it was like music, philosophy, I don't know, because they could afford music, philosophy, I don't know. But, so I would say that, but I had a similar experience at college was. The second thing I would say is that what we have to be able to do is to say two things at once, and I think that is what the humanities is good at teaching people to do. And what I've tried to suggest here is that it's not about not saying that we're an economic engine. It's not about not saying that we don't help the city and help the state. We have to say two things at the same time. That one, UWM does that, and two, UWM provides a quality liberal arts education. And on this campus, I mean, you haven't maybe had a chance to walk around much. It's the most compact campus in the country in terms of students per square space, and that could actually be something we can use to our advantage. To say it's got the feel of a liberal arts college, even though it's anyway. But I think saying more than one thing at the same time is an important part of how we have to move forward and what we can be.
I agree with you, but I'm just thinking of a fact-based Senate meeting I went to where, speaking of the one, we're an economic driver, and two, the statement that was being crafted for the university publicity was that, yes, there is the economic driver and business partnerships and patents and things like that. And that was the main part of the statement that was being, and people were protesting and saying, well, you're leaving this other mission out. But I feel like it turned into a 1-2 thing where the 1 and 2 was like, 1, this is the most important part. And the 2 was like, we got to throw this in there. Sense, you know what I mean?
Well, we need to say one way.
Or maybe we reverse it, or, no, but, I mean, that was my sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That it was like, 1, we really need to impress people that we're gonna be this economic driver, and, a few people protested, we need to add that,
Yeah.
we still do this liberal arts stuff.
Right.
The question that's been swirling around for me is just the question of bad faith, right? An elite class that's immune to persuasion entirely. And the reason I think of that, I'm just reading your own piece today from IEH about Georgia Tech, right, where they present this document arguing for the gluification of their program that's based on internal incoherence that they must have known didn't work, right? I mean, they knew it was bullshit when they put it out. The revenue models, right, that constantly make it look like every aspect of the university loses money, even though many of them don't, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of the elite kind of administrative class of the university system that just wants to loot the place. And I'm curious about your thoughts about, to what extent are some of these people just immune to persuasion? They know exactly what they want to do, and it's a kind of non-democratic process that needs to, or differently democratic process that needs to happen.
Yeah, or an actual democratic process.
Yeah, that's how I prefer to.
Yeah, I mean, in France, I know it's just a country I'm not supposed to mention in this country, they actually vote for their presidents at universities. And it's not just faculty, it's staff and it's students who get a vote and who's going to represent them. That would be a massive improvement because we do have this kind of split between the people that are doing the educational work, I was talking about, and then the people that are actually making the business decisions. And there's really poor communication. And my general sense is that having done a lot of persuasion, in an academic senate around planning and budget stuff for years and years and years on my campus and at the system-wide level above, I don't know that they're simply unpersuadable as that they can't imagine operating outside of the paradigm that they've basically been slotted into. And they're afraid to use heterodoxic arguments with legislators or with regents or whoever it is that they're having to, because with each other, there's a lot of concern about not getting the next promotion or just maybe even losing the job that you already have because you don't seem like you're with the program. So on the one hand, in private, they did in fact sometimes agree with us. In public, they just felt like they could never fight the culture that had already decided all these sort of neoliberal things and that required then entrepreneurial universities and business partnerships and all of that. So my reaction now is just to try to create, as I was saying, to try to work with the 80% or the 90%, starting with my own colleagues, the 5 or 10% of my own colleagues who are already sort of on board with this, and address that potential majority. And if the majority can actually be hegemonized in the old sort of McLeod and Moose sense in the 80s into something with some momentum, then it won't really matter so much what those folks think are plausible or thinkable, or they will, and most of them will actually change their minds. The looters, it's a smaller group, and I don't, they're not really the ones that are actually in office so much as the people that are standing behind it. So I think it's budgeable if you start from the bottom up rather than doing what I spent in some ways too many years doing, which is trying to just change the minds of the people that are essentially just pinned to the wall.
It's important to emphasize that if we go at the question of the adjunctification of the university, and as you were suggesting, bring a lot more of those people into the governance of the university, then this displacement of accountability in which administrators are relatively autonomous in relationship to the faculty could be countered. The fewer faculty there are, the more autonomy that they have, and the more staff who have no relationship to governance, the more power the administrators have.
Right.
And I was at that meeting in Ega when the chancellor came in with that ridiculous mission statement. It was the first time that anybody other than a group of deans had seen this mission statement for the whole university. They had all rubber stamped it, of course, not a one said a word. And this meeting just dissolved into chaos when an actual group of faculty had a chance to look at it. And the result was the thing got watered down to the point where, of course, it's just meaningless pathway at this point. But it was remarkable that the chancellor, or now outgoing chancellor, was really surprised that he would have to be accountable to a faculty group in articulating the mission of the university, and that he just wanted this quick little statement they could put on brochures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that battle really has to be fought. The Senate model is pretty defunct.
Nothing worse than
Exactly. Senate meeting. Yeah, it's too bad because it had a lot of potential. The concept of shared governance, but it really required information exchange and people being upstream in the decisions and not just being plopped at the end and so on. So that's another thing where confrontation rather than just kind of cooperating as we have is going to be part of the process.
Well, maybe we should call it a day. We're working over
fight over the.
All right, that's